Mute everybody. Hang on.
Give him my water, forget it, Dave. Well, thank you.
This is going to be a little different from the normal talk because many of you read the article in your newsletter that covers some of the ground that I'm going to go over tonight, but other people who are here this evening, I don't think have probably seen that article. So there may be a little bit of overlap in what you already know, but I've added enough, I think, that it'll keep you interested. As Don said, I'm an archaeologist who's worked at Santa Elena on Paris Island. St. Augustine was founded first in the fall of 1565, and Santa Elena was founded in the spring of 1566. Santa Elena was only occupied for a total of 21 years, and then was abandoned as a result of Francis Drake's raid on St. Augustine in 1586. But it's in this image, you can see it's on the Marine Corps golf course on the south end of Paris Island, South Carolina, and is accessed by this very small winding creek that runs along the front of the golf course there. So that the site of Santa Elena is actually about a mile from the Beaufort River, and it is accessed only by this small tidal creek that comes right up to the edge of the island, as you can see here. Stanley South, my colleague, started digging at Santa Elena in 1979. I joined him in 1991, and our last excavations there were in 2007. So we've been since then working to get funds to reprocess all the collections and completely reanalyze everything. And now we're about $650,000 into that project and getting close to the end. So we hope to have a lot of interesting things coming out of Santa Elena. In Santa Elena's 21 years, it had 5 Spanish forts that were used and abandoned or occupied and burned by the Indians. And ultimately the last one was just abandoned when the Spanish left. We found some of those forts, and that work on those forts is what got me interested in St. Augustine and led to my work there in 2019. When Stanley South went to Santa Elena for the first time in 1979, he got a small grant from the university and he did shovel tests, or 3-foot squares actually, you can see dotted in the central portion of this figure. And he immediately discovered and uncovered the outline of a Spanish fort. So he'd been there 1 week and he found a fort that we didn't know, or he didn't know exactly where it was. Turns out it was San Felipe I, built by Juan Pardo in 1566, making it the second fort. The first fort, San Salvador, was built in spring of 1566, probably existed somewhere into the later 1560s and then was abandoned. You'll note on Stan's diagram, he calls this Fort San Felipe II in the upper right-hand corner of his label, but that's incorrect. It's actually the first fort. So this is half eroded away. The bottom half of this image goes into the marsh where that creek was. So we've got about half of this fort left. We have another image of what would have been the fourth fort at Santa Elena. This is Fort San Marcos I, as we call it, which was built in 1577. The previous fort, Fort San Felipe II, was burned by the Indians in 1576, and the Spaniards were forced to abandon their town. We don't know where that fort is at the present time. This fort was built when the Spanish came back under Pedro Menendez Marquez in 1577. It's supposedly a duplicate of the fort that was then standing in St. Augustine, because they prefabricated the timbers, loaded them on board ships, hauled them up to Santa Elena, and put up this fort in 6 days because they were afraid of Indian attack, because they'd been forced to leave because the Indians were angry. And when they came back, they were surrounded by Indians, but the Indians did not attack. this particular fort so far as we know. It's an outline drawing, but taking this drawing and the description from an inspector who came in 1578 and described the interior of this fort and his companion fort in St. Augustine, I was able to work with a model builder and a computer graphics person. And this is a reconstruction of what I think Fort San Marcos the first looked like at Santa Elena in 1577. It existed until about 1582 when the timbers began to rot and they needed to rebuild the fort. So royal slaves came up from St. Augustine and salvaged some materials from this fort and built another fort on the shoreline of what's now Paris Island. And to the right of this image, you can see the creek. So this is one of the meanders of the tidal creek I showed you in the aerial photo at the beginning of my Santa Elena presentation. This is Fort San Marcos II. It was built on the edge of the marsh. Fort San Marcos I was built inland, away from the shoreline, because they thought that was better defense against possible Indian attack. This one was put here on the shoreline in a period when the Indian issues had been resolved and they were more concerned about attacks by Frenchmen or others and not so much by Indians. And so they wanted the water access and the guns closer to the shoreline to defend the harbor and the approach across the marsh by the tidal creek that comes up to Santa Elena. This is the fort that was occupied in the very last years of Santa Elena. It's the one where the soldiers would have been stationed when Santa Elena was abandoned in 1587, the year after Francis Drake attacked and burned St. Augustine. And they needed the soldiers and the cannon. You can see there's quite an array of cannon here to resupply St. Augustine, because Francis Drake took all the cannon when he left St. Augustine in 1586. So that they shut down this fort, dismantled it, burned the building that you can see inside, and everybody that was here was relocated to St. Augustine. So that with these forts, then we now have seen this site is known archaeologically. It was actually the moat for this fort was standing open continuously from the time it was abandoned in 1587 until the Marine Corps filled it in 1918. And because there was such uproar locally, the moat was re-excavated, and you can go there today and see about the left-hand half of this fort. The right-hand half is completely washed away. But it was these forts and these drawings and the fact that we hadn't found all the forts at Santa Elena, and I was curious about what the forts look like in St. Augustine, that I turned towards St. Augustine and the records there to learn a little bit more. And so this is an image of a St. Augustine fort. And this is probably the same fort that the drawing was made at Santa Elena in 1577. I told you it was a companion fort, but they put a pointed gun deck on the one at Santa Elena, and this one has a rectangular gun deck, but the building itself behind that gun deck is pretty much like the one at Santa Elena. This is actually the fourth fort at St. Augustine, built in 1572. What happened at St. Augustine is Pedro Menendez established St. Augustine in the fall of 1565. The town and the fort were on the mainland until the spring of 1566, when both the fort and the town were relocated to Anastasia Island. The settlement stayed on Anastasia Island from 1566 to 1572, when it relocated back to the mainland, and was at that point located where St. Augustine is now located. We know that Kathy Deegan's been working up at the Fountain of Youth on the early settlement there and the fortifications that go with that. so that we know a little bit about the 1565, early 1566 fort, but we don't really have a good fortification to show for that period. I got interested in looking at the second and third forts because there are no drawings of those two forts. They moved to the island. They established the fort, the first fort on Anastasia, close to the shoreline, and it immediately began washing away. So they had to relocate the fort slightly back from the shoreline to prevent further erosion. And presumably the town was somewhere there close by, but there are no drawings of the town and its location or either of those forts. And then, as I said, in 1572, they moved back to the mainland and built this fort. So we've got another drawing or two of St. Augustine forts that are later, but I'm not really going to worry about those tonight. So in deciding that I would look more into the forts at St. Augustine in the hope of figuring out at least where they might be, since most have not been located. Kathy, as I said, has been working up in the Fountain of Youth area. Carl Halbert found part of what he thinks is one of the later forts where the bus stop is located adjacent to the Pirate and Treasure Museum on Castillo. But other than that, there's just not much relating to forts in St. Augustine. So I began looking at the maps showing St. Augustine and its harbor, and there are quite a number of them. And one of the early ones that caught my attention is this Joseph Purcell map of 1577. And you can see St. Augustine's on the left, Matanzas River, and then St. Anastasia Island is this called. And just above the writing that says St. Anastasia Island, you can see there's this worm-like landscape feature that, and I'll show you a little bit more of a close-up, that indicates that there's high ground there. And so everything else that's shown is marsh on this particular map. The higher ground where the lighthouse and other developed areas are on Anastasia is over to the right, just above where the pond is on the extreme right of the map. And this is a close-up of the tip of that worm-like feature. And if you look at the above where the saint is, you can see the tip of that landscape feature, and there are actually earthworks shown there. So that piqued my interest a little bit, but as it turns out, that's where Oglethorpe Battery Park is located, on that end of this high ground feature. There's another set of, I don't know if you can see it, but you probably can't, but over just if you go straight up above where the D is an island on Anastasia Island, there's a very faint earthwork shown at that location. So if you go online and look up the Joseph Purcell map of 1577, you can see it. So that seeing that landscape feature, the high ground that was there, made me think, okay, maybe this is a place to look. And so particularly interested in that earthwork. And Carl Halbert sent me a copy of the door map, which is a more carefully made contour map dating to 1860. And this yellow outline shown on the topo map here is what the door map shows as that same high ground with some more detail in its extent and in its shape. And there's actually a little creek or a place where a creek flows sort of right in the center of that yellow. And this is where it falls on a Google Earth image. So that this gave me some idea of where I might look for this ridge, much of which is eroded away. You can see most of the worm-like structure is gone. There's just the far northern end, and then the other 2/3 of it or more, it has eroded away and goes off into the marsh. There's a big restaurant right there where that yellow landform goes off into that bay now. So that I took this, I identified the street names. I went to talk to John Reagan, the city manager. I got permission to work in the right-of-ways along the streets in this part of what is Davis Shores development, a development with what was done in built in 1926, so that all of that marsh that showed up on the Joseph Purcell map of 1777 was filled in by dredge fill. And here's an image of what that north end of Anastasia looked like during the dredge operations for the 1926 Davis Shores development. So that the ridge is sort of right through here. I don't know if you can see that cursor, but sort of right up in the upper center, just above that straight line, which is the highway that runs across Anastasia Island. We don't know a lot about exactly what was done with the fill. Tremendous amount of dredge fill was pumped up there. We don't know if they pumped fill to the top of the ridge that shows up on the Purcell map and made it nice and level, or if they pumped a lot of fill in and then bulldozed away the top of the ridge that shows up on the Purcell map or the door map and leveled everything out that way. I kind of think they filled up to the top of the ridge, but there's really no way to know. This is the development topographic map for Davis Shores. And over to the right, you can see some topography back from the shoreline a little bit. It actually shows Oglethorpe Battery Park on the end of that landform, and that is called Butcher Pen Creek that comes up to that landform on that map. That creek was one of the reasons I thought that this landform might be a good place to work, because that creek is directly across from the Castillo. So this creek is called Butcher Pen Creek. Whoops, I'll go back up. And I thought that creek was important because that's how people would have got out to that ridge and maybe ultimately to the settlement on Anastasia Island. It's certainly the way the people who were out there in the sentry station that was on Anastasia beginning in 1565 or 1566 got there. It's not the clearest map. If you want to go see it, it's at the Historical Society there, so you can go take a look. So here's the places where I dug shovel test. Any of you been in Davis Shores? The upper top part of the photograph, the right wide street, is Oglethorpe Boulevard, and the lower line of shovel test is Andreas Street, and North Matanzas Boulevard and Ribot are the other streets we tested. The big cluster of green shovel test in the upper left are at Oglethorpe Battery Park. So we dug all these shovel tests in the city right-of-ways, hoping to cross that sand ridge. Most of these shovel tests we dug to a depth of 2 to 3 feet to make sure we got through any fill that was there to reach whatever underlying remnants there were of the sand ridge. As it turns out, we found almost nothing in these shovel tests. We found one rim of a Spanish chamber pot of a time period that's yet to be determined. Up in Oglethorpe Battery Park, we found a few Indian sherds, a couple sherds of olive jar, and everything else was pretty much devoid of Spanish material. We did find a few blocks of coquina that we left in place that might have been parts of later structures. But in thinking back about it, again, we don't know for sure how much damage Mr. Davis did to the site after his fill operation. If there was a ridge here, there was occupation, and it was all pushed off to make additional fill around that ridge, then there's really nothing that we were going to find in these shovel tests except stray sherds. Up around Oglethorpe Battery Park, I think we did find some remnant of the original battery. So I don't think that everything there was pushed off. So maybe that's an indication that there wasn't as much earth moving as there might have been. the right of ways along these streets varied between 6 and 10 feet. Oglethorpe Boulevard, which is a very wide street, had a 10-foot right of way. This is North Matanzas Boulevard. It had a 6-foot right of way. There are utility lines that were put in there originally in 1925, 1926. They've been replaced through the decades. So there was, in some places, a great deal of disturbance in these right-of-ways, making it very hard to find an undisturbed location to dig our shovel tests. But in almost every case, we were able to move to one side or the other, avoid the pipes that were there, and get a good view of the ground that we were looking for. As I said, we worked a lot. We did a lot of testing at Oglethorpe Battery Park, and we dug more here in part because I was interested in knowing how much disturbance there might have been and whether we could document it, and also to get some idea of exactly where Oglethorpe's battery was located. Based on what we saw in our shovel test, I think the area around the monument itself is on fill, or is fill. And the monument and everything you see here is built atop fill, whereas just to the south of that is an earthwork, which is said to be a recreation of Oglethorpe's battery, which appears to be on the very tip end of the ridge, as we saw on Davis Shore's development map that Mr. Davis had done, that blue line print. So that we learned a little bit about that. Carl Halbert and I have talked about going back and maybe doing a little bit more work in Oglethorpe Park, Battery Park, and see what we could find there. My crew and I were down for 2 weeks in 2019. So we had wonderful weather, it wasn't too hot, and we found a lot. Wanted to say that one of the problems in figuring out where the town of St. Augustine and the forts associated with it were in 1566 to 1572 is there's been a tremendous amount of erosion and some deposition in other places. So that when I was looking at those early maps, I saw that worm-like ridge from the 1777 map, which most of which is now eroded away, but places over where the lighthouse is and the school and up in that direction have not been so significantly eroded. Carl Halbert, when we were working down here, told me that he thought that the fort was out closer to the beach, to the farther to the south and east of where we were working. And that's probably a likely location, though I thought it was still worth testing what we had to look at here, if nothing else, just to rule it out. I would say nobody else ever needs to go back and dig in the rights of way along these streets to look for anything relating to old St. Augustine. I did want to point out, though, the erosion and the deposition in this image, that's the north end of Anastasia Island, and behind it is North Island or North Beach Island, or the remnant of it is where Volano Beach is today, I guess, or maybe that's Volano Beach over straight across from Anastasia. Whatever that feature is, has changed, because this is what the view is today. So that you're looking from above St. Augustine, across Bridge of Lions to Anastasia and to Conch Island out there beyond. Conch Island has completely formed since about the 1880s. So there was no landform out there in the 1880s. And that whole far side of Anastasia Island in this image was the shoreline at St. Augustine. So that given the amount of deposition and erosion that we can see, between 1880 and the present day, you can just use your imagination to think about how much erosion and deposition and change there has probably been since 1566. So that it sort of complicates the whole problem of figuring out exactly where old St. Augustine was located. So I would say that we gave it an effort. We looked in a place that probably nobody else was going to look anytime in the near future. We did not find much of anything, but I think that we can conclusively say that there's nothing there in that north end of that worm-like feature that shows up on the Joseph Purcell map, though it might have been there earlier, got bulldozed away, or covered up by dredge fill. That concludes my lecture, and I will be glad to answer any questions you may have. And Don says we can ask questions through chat.
Yeah, you can use that chat box on the bottom.
How many? Oh, yeah, I guess I didn't say, we excavate about 250 shovel tests. And as I said, many of them were down as deep as 3 feet and sometimes even deeper than that. Any plans to dig farther south is the next question. I don't plan on going back to St. Augustine and doing anything else unless I do work with Carl a little bit on Oglethorpe Battery Park. I would be glad to go down and observe if anybody else goes out and does any testing. There are certainly places on on Anastasia Island that are worth looking at. As I say, around the lighthouse and farther out is an area that has not eroded away in the recent past. And so it could be that there's some remnant of old St. Augustine there, though I have a project that I'm working on taking those old maps and trying to figure out where erosional loss and deposition has taken place in the last few hundred years. So that might help somebody else down the road. After so much consideration, where you would advise, I have not gone out and walked around on any other parts of Anastasia Island to even think about where else to dig, because it's mostly private property. And as I say, Carl Halbert had some idea where it was. We know it was close to the shoreline because it started eroding away. One of the forts did out there almost immediately. So I wish everyone else that ever wants to work out there looking better luck than I had. Question, do I plan on additional excavations at Santa Elena? Yes, we do. We have taken a long break to obtain funds to process all of the collections we accumulated between 1979 and 2007. It's around 800 or 850 cubic feet. Everything was in plastic bags that dated back to the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. So everything needed to be rebagged. Lots of things that were never completely washed have been rewashed. And every item is being looked at again and being analyzed to a single standard, because Stan South started working there 1979. He was a British colonial archaeologist, and so he didn't know much about Spanish. So some of those earlier identifications need updating. We've learned a lot about Spanish material in the intervening years, and also the Native American collection. So the whole reanalysis effort is a really important part of what we've undertaken, I believe. And as I said, it's taken many years and hundreds of thousands of dollars so far to do it. Any other questions?
Yeah, Chester, somebody sent one that said, I don't have a question, but I live on David Shores and I found a piece of pottery by the waterfront. And I have always suspected more archaeological evidence being there.
I have to say that I did not walk the shoreline there at all. Really didn't have the opportunity or the time to do it. I would not be surprised, given the amount of erosion that's been done there, that anything that would have been up on high land is eroded in. And as you know, the Spanish came there starting in 1566. So there could be any number of things there. Carl has found Spanish material out on the beach, as have others, so that there's no doubt that there is Spanish material out there scattered around, and perhaps some remnant of the old town still exists.
Okay.
Any others? Okay, well, thank you. Whoops. An quite mundane question. You were in the right of way. Whoops, where did it go? Don, that question went away for me. Can
Yeah,
you
I
read
have it
to
here.
me?
It says, I had a previous meeting, so I didn't hear who sponsored your work. A mundane question. You were in the right of way, but I imagine most homeowners cared for their grass. Or I saw the shovel test.
Oh.
Did your group replace the grass? I'm sure they did.
Oh, okay. Well, two things. One is that I have a group of people who are my friends and supporters in South Carolina. So I told them I was going to St. Augustine, and they contributed the money I needed to go down with a crew and spend 2 weeks. And I had an acknowledgement image that I forgot to flash up, and I'll tell you what it said. It said, I thank John Reagan, city manager, Carl Halbert, and J. Michael Francis, my colleagues and friends who were supporters of the work, the homeowners in Davis Shores who were so patient when we dug plugs out of their carefully manicured lawns, and my crew who enjoyed a 2-week stay in St. Augustine, as I always do when I'm there. So that the homeowners in Davis Shores were very patient. A couple came out and asked what we thought we were doing, and we told them, and they were satisfied, and they were quite interested in what we were doing. The lawns over there are quite manicured, and we very carefully screened all of our soil onto plastic and put back all the soil and the plug of very nice St. Augustine grass in each and every hole. So I would imagine the fact that we was there, it isn't even visible when you walk along those streets. For the Oglethorpe area, the stratigraphy of the ridge was relatively distinct. We only dug a couple of our shovel tests into that earthwork just to see if it had some antiquity to it, or if it was something that had been created when the monument was put up sometime in the past. We did find that enough evidence, I think, to say that that earthwork is on the original location. How extensive the earthwork is, I can't say at this point, but I think it is at least a portion of the original earthwork. Okay, well, maybe that's the last one.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I enjoyed it.
Okay, Chester, thank you very much. Very interesting. A couple of things before we end. Let me just share the screen and try and bring up that name the artifact. Does anyone have any ideas what that is? You can use the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can tell us, because I don't have a clue. Catherine, are you on?
I am.
Aha.
Hmm.
I don't think we have any takers.
Is it a
Hello.
really flat piece of bone? Is that what it is?
It is a piece of bone.
I
Is it
think
really flat?
It's,
I
yeah,
think it's a corset stay.
Oh, Greg thought it was maybe part of a fan.
he would be right. It is a
Ah.
fan stick. Yep. So it's the interior. I have an example here of a fan. It's one of these supporting fan sticks.
Okay.
It
Very
is
good.
made out of bone, hand carved. It's fairly plain for what it is. It's found in obviously multiple pieces, and we found it down on Avonlea Street in a trash pit, absolutely filled with shell. It is a small miracle that we found it at all, and managed to identify it for what it was, and retain all of those tiny little pieces to mend in the lab.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's
What-
in really good condition now. It's held up, considering it was screened through several kilograms of shell, it held up pretty good.
All right.
That was the
Okay,
only one.
great. Very good. Excellent.
Yeah, it was the only one that was found in that trash pit. We didn't excavate the whole trash pit. It was a shovel test that was very lucky.
And it was all broken up when you found it like that?
Yeah, it was all broken up. Volunteers did an excellent job, picked it out of the screen by some miracle and saw it. We didn't even recognize it until we got it back to the lab and looked at it a little more. But
Oh,
it's pretty
interesting.
cool. The form of it isn't very distinctive for a particular time period, but the artifacts that were found with it dates that deposit to about 1730.
Good, excellent. All right, let me just end the meeting, but tell you the next one will be on the 6th of April. And we have Dr. Sam Turner who's going to speak with us. And the topic is a window into the past, archaeological monitoring on May Street. For the people who don't know where May Street is, if you come over the bridge, not the Bridge Alliance, the one above it, the Volano Beach Bridge, that's May Street. They're doing a lot of digging there, so should be an interesting talk. And again, it's the 6th of April, same time, same station. Anything else? If not, we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Chester.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. See you later.
Okay.